Hi, everybody. My name is Ed Beck. I am the open and online learning specialist from SUNY Oneonta. I work down in the faculty center, and a surprising amount of my brain space is taken up thinking about open source software. I was brought into the open source community kicking and screaming. My first job in higher ed, I was at a very small, very poorly funded institution, and they didn't have a learning management system. And they hired me, which was their first mistake. And as their second mistake, I kind of walked in and said, okay, so you wanted me to set up the learning management system. What's our budget for this? What can we spend to build a system that's going to touch every single class at this institution? And my supervisor kind of smiled at me and said, we currently don't have a budget. We were hoping you could explore some open source solutions. And that I was skeptical of that at first. And it was a challenge at first for me to start to think about open source technology as equivalent and as just as good as and as possibly superior to things that you pay for. But through that position and through the ones that have developed afterwards, I've really started to have a really great appreciation for the open source products that we use and for the communities that built around them. And it's taken up both my professional work and also my volunteerism. I'm the treasurer and on the board of directors for WP Campus, the organization for WordPress in higher education. I think about open source all the time and what I'm doing at my institution and what other people are doing. And where this talk kind of came from, the origins of it, is I was reading a memo from the Department of Defense on open source technology. And in this memo, they kind of outlined their position on open source technology and also gave guidelines for its senior management and its project managers of how they should be dealing with and interacting with open source technology. And, as someone who's been an advocate now in SUNY for a long time on open source, I really started to, see as I read this memo couple times through, wow, this is really a series of decisions that the Department of Defense has made where they are defining what their relationship should be to this type of technology. Now, why does this belong at a digital learning conference? Like, why do we care about open source technology in the context of a digital learning conference? I've been to several great talks already about data privacy, about data security. And one of the things that is very important when we're making these very important decisions about the technologies we use and we choose is this concept of ownership. Who owns the platforms? Who owns the systems? Who owns all of the traffic that we create on there? And I would put forward that as we become more aware of the way our data is being weaponized against us, that controlling our own systems and our own processes becomes very, very important. And open source is not the only solution for these, but it can be one very important toolkit that we should consider. Hey, maybe instead of purchasing this service where we have to sign their terms of agreement, perhaps we should choose a different service, a different type of tool in which we can make our own terms and make our own decisions about what data we're going to collect and what we're going to track. In the first, paragraph of this, in the first paragraph of this memo, in the introduction, I just wanted to highlight, a little bit of their introduction of when they start to describe open source, what are they talking about? And these highlights are my emphasis. The Department of Defense said, we really have to recognize that the trend towards open source is no longer making it a neat division between what we call open source tools and commercial tools. What we are seeing increasingly is that the open source tools are influencing the way all software is designed, developed, deployed, and operated. And so we need to change all of the way we're thinking about this. And we can no longer just think in a binary. We have to be thinking about open source in terms of all the software that we buy. And especially the second part that I'm highlighting here, when we say open source, a lot of us think about at the application level. Oh, the open source learning management system is Moodle. Oh, the open source website systems are WordPress and Drupal. But at the DoD, they're saying, no, you've got to remember that a lot of software is modular. And so you have to do an analysis all the way down to the components and the libraries, all of the building blocks that make up this individual software. So, one of the arguments that I'm going to be putting forward is we can't say as a higher ed community, as an individual institution, you can't say anymore, oh, we don't do open source. You can't opt out of open source. And this is part of the reason why you need an open source policy, is because so much of the software that we use that is being developed are using these open source components and open source libraries to build them up. Now, think about 2 years ago when the SUNY system was still on the Blackboard, a learning management system. There was a critical exposure security problem with a JavaScript library that was used inside of Blackboard. Just because we were paying millions of dollars as a SUNY system to have access to Blackboard did not exempt us from this vulnerability that was in that open source library that was used inside this commercial project. And so part of what we have to do when we think about this is we're talking about being able to include open source in the ways we operate. We also have to recognize that many of the companies that we purchase from, many of the commercial vendors that we are going to be using, they have also included open source in the ways they operate. Instead of writing every single piece of code from scratch, they're pulling from libraries, components, they're pulling things in from different projects, and we have to be aware of that because it's going to change our relationship both with the open source community and also with our commercial vendors. So this is part of my pitch here is don't think that by paying for products, you've opted out of open source, because you really can. So I've really, tried to find and look at this and say, you know what? There were 6 key decisions the Department of Justice made as they crafted this memo, as they created this policy towards open source. And I'm going to go through these 6 questions kind of line by line, and I'm going to both talk about what the Department of Defense chose as they made that decision, and also just kind of brainstorm like what are the other alternatives that an institution could choose, because we're thinking about this in a way that like, could you build your own institutional guidelines and plans for open source from this kind of framework that the Department of Justice created? I'm sorry, not Department of Justice, Department of Defense. So from the very beginning, I think all good policy should start with why. Why should we do this? And one of the things that the Department of Defense does is they make a business case for open source. They make a case that because open source software, the source code is shared with a large community of developers, all who have eyes on it, all who are doing peer reviews, they make an argument that open source may actually be more secure than closed source code. That there's more scrutiny put on those open source applications, and that gives a greater opportunity to identify threats and identify vulnerabilities in the software team that you might not have from a small, dedicated software team. They make the argument that because of the permissions inherent with open source technology, that might allow the department to be more agile and make changes if necessary in according to different mission parameters or mission needs. And they really make a case that they don't want to be locked into a single vendor. They acknowledge that it might still happen that only one vendor might be able to provide the services they need because of the tight security and guidelines that they have in the way they scrutinize their vendors. But because if they use open source solutions, there might be multiple vendors that could host an application for them, and this lets them have more a negotiating power. That I'm on the CIO calls right now as part of my position in the Doodle organization, and they're talking about an 1,000% increase in the licensing cost for a certain application that is really causing them a lot of consternation. When you only have one vendor, you can get locked in, and then you're kind of at their mercy if that's an essential service that you need to continue. By using open source that might be able to be supported by multiple vendors, they're saying as a business case, this is good for business for the Department of Defense. They also highlight on the lack of per seat licensing costs for many open source applications. And this really resonated with me as something that might be important for a higher ed institution. Imagine that your provost or your president walked up to you tomorrow and said, you know what? I went to a great talk on e-portfolios, and I really think that everyone at our institution should have an e-portfolio experience in e-portfolio process. Well, if we start to go out to commercial e-portfolio vendors, they might give us a per student cost and say, it's going to be $15 per student. It's going to be $20 per student. And a lot of times when we negotiate those deals, they don't charge us like the water company based on actual usage. They charge us based on the most that could possibly be in the system. So if I'm at an institution that has about 6,000 full-time equivalent students, they're going to want me to purchase 6,000 licenses times $20 each. And that's going to be a large ask I would need to fulfill that provost's vision or that president's vision. That's going to put extra scrutiny on the project for me, that I really have to get to 3,000 portfolios very quickly, or else this is not going to be seen as worth it. If you go a different direction, if you choose an open source solution that doesn't have that per seat license, it lets you be more agile. You can try something out. You can say, you know what, let's pilot this with 300 students, with 400 students. Let's see if it grows organically, and let's evaluate how much money we're putting into this project after that. So that agility to test drive, to be able to use it and not incur those large costs up front, these are all important for the Department of Defense. Now, as an open source advocate, I might have other reasons I would like to be really important for that. I might believe that open source software is a public good. I might believe that as a state university, we have a responsibility to be using open source software, because when the State University of New York chooses open source software, it strengthens the ecosystem so that every public library and every little school that might not be as well funded as a state university can also have high quality software that they are working with. I think there's other reasons to choose open source, but I think it's also okay to say, you know what, I can contain multitudes, and I can recognize the business case for open source at the same time as the ethical and security and other decisions that we're making. Okay. And I also, think that it's good to have the ability to switch between the different arguments for open source, depending on our audience and who we're talking to. There are people that want to see that business case. And I think the DoD did a great job right here of making a business case for open source software. One of the things that I found most remarkable about the DoD's policy is they adopted a policy that first prioritizes the adoption of open source even before procurement. And I said, wow, that's a really interesting decision that they have made, where they have actually said, you know what, our preference is towards open source. And it really got me thinking about what I would want my university to do and what I would want all of SUNY to do as an open source policy. And I do not see SUNY adopting a policy that says, no, we prefer open source. I would be thrilled if SUNY adopted a policy that says, you know what, we're not going to give preferential treatment to open source technology. We will just consider open source at the same time as we look at commercial software. We're going to set up processes in our procurement process that say open source will be considered on equal standing with the commercial software. Now, what I think our current state is kind of what is in the yellow on this slide right here. I think right now, open source is not prohibited, but it can be excluded from the pool and excluded from RFP processes because of the way we've set it up. We need a vendor who comes in as an advocate. And I think that that's a key point and a place that a university open source office should be able to step in and be like, you know what? In this RFP process, I will be the advocate for the open source solution. So, I mean, this is a decision right here. And I think that this is an example of where the Department of Defense has actually made a very large pro open source commitment. I would be thrilled with a much lower commitment level from my state university. I would be thrilled if we would just, set a policy that says, you know what, we are going to consider at the same time as those commercial options, open source options. So as we start to look at these decisions that the Department of Ed or Department of Defense has made, that one was very kind of pro open source, but it wasn't, this whole memo wasn't like a cheerleader, rah, rah, rah for open source. They really identified 4 areas that they said, this is where we need to put a lot of scrutiny on open source software to make sure it meets our needs. Starting from the left and moving right, remember that I said that the Department of Defense had identified as a strength of open source the large community that might have eyes on a specific project. And so then that becomes an area that they said we need to apply scrutiny to this, because all open source is not created equal. We have open source software that has thousands of developers contributing to it and that has many, many eyes on it. And we also have open source projects that have a single developer or a small 2 to 3 person team of developers that keep them floating. And so one of the things that the Department of Defense said is, if you are going to make the choice to use open source technology, you need to look and see, what does that community look like that you are starting to participate in? If it's a large community, this can be a big plus. It can be something that's important for us to consider. If it's a small community, we're not saying stop, but that might be a red flag. We need to look at that and say, will this project still be around for the duration of whatever mission that software is fulfilling? Okay. Going to the next one, the system architecture, the update frequency, the processes, these are all very important to the Department of Defense. They want to know that they have something that can be updated quickly on the fly, that updates are happening periodically, and that there are dedicated processes in place to, for example, report security issues. Is there a process that they could report a security issue and have that be fixed and integrated in the core program? In higher ed, we've become very accustomed to that software as a service model where we have 100% uptime for the project, where we have new versions being pushed out very frequently. We have continuous development, continuous integration of the newest version into what we're using. This is what we have like in the Brightspace platform. And so seeing if that system architecture would fit that same ideal is going to be really important because there are open source projects that can be quickly deployed, quickly updated, and used in the same way for that 100% uptime, continuous, integration. If that's what we want, we have to be able to define that in our RFPs and choose the open source that matches it. If things need to be taken down in order to upgrade, if they're not updated very regularly, this might be just a flag that says, you know what, this open source project isn't the right one for me. And for the Department of Defense, it's very important for them. They want to know what forks and mirrors of different open source projects are out there and to choose the right one. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit because they want to find a trusted repository that they can pull from and not have to and not have to maintain their own version of the software internally. And then the biggest issue, and I left this last because I have an additional slide on, is probably dependency management. Understanding what are all the small building blocks inside this larger open source project that are going to make up the software. So CISA, the Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency, is starting to recommend building into procurement processes asking for a software bill of materials as part of that procurement process. Tell me all of the little libraries and tools that are integrated into your product so that I can better understand. And when you are looking at this, we should start to think about like, okay, are these all latest version? Are all these within the security window? Do they know what's in their product so that they can show that it's being updated regularly? And where I would argue, again, kind of as an advocate for open source, I wouldn't just judge those open source applications on that. I would put that in the procurement process for all technology so that when you buy technology from anyone, whether that's commercial or whether you're choosing to adopt some open source, you are saying to them, I want to know what's in there, and I want to see in there a strategy where you are continuously updating what you are selling me. Just for fun, I went and I looked at Microsoft PowerPoint for Mac, and I did the nerdy thing. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and look at all the third-party notices. Tell me what open source tools and what open source things are inside PowerPoint for Mac. Now, obviously, PowerPoint for Mac is commercial software, but this is me trying to drive home my point that you can't just say anymore, oh, we don't use open source technology. Open source technology has fundamentally changed the way all software is developed, so that when even in a commercial project, you're going to see libraries and tools and pieces and code snippets that are coming from a wide variety of places. And so just in, Microsoft PowerPoint for Mac, there's 122 that they've disclosed over here. Now, this isn't what we would call a software bill of goods. These are actually just the ones that that the license required them to tell. And so this isn't quite what I'm advocating for yet, because this doesn't even, for example, show the versions of all these different things. You can see there's 122 different projects that they're just telling us, oh, by the way, the license told us that we had to be clear that this was involved and that those were included in this larger project. So we've got a long way to go here. If we want to analyze commercial software, we should be doing it in the RFP process and being very, scrutinizing that a little bit to make sure that the software that we're buying is being well maintained, because there can be poorly maintained commercial projects and there can be poorly maintained open source projects. And as we start to be more explicit about that criteria, I think what we actually are going to be doing is leveling the playing field between these commercial and open source vendors. I'm on decision 4. What hosting configurations make sense for your organization or your project? And this is really important to me because many people, their perception of when they say like, oh, we're going to do this, the open source route, we're going to use some open source technology, what they think they're saying is, oh, I have to self-host this. oh, this means it's all on me. And one of the things that I want to put out there is there's many very legitimate ways to participate in that open source community. So yes, you could make the choice that you're going to run it with your own staff on your own servers. You could make the choice that you're going to use your own staff and run it on cloud servers that are not on premises, or you might enter into a service contract that says, I would like this external company to support this open source. And again, this is a decision that you should be able to make as an institution, depending on the priority level of what you're doing. There might be some things that you're very comfortable just running on premises, running it yourself. There might be some other things that you need to guarantee 100% uptime and saying, you know what? I'm going to be participating in the open source ecosystem, but I want a service contract with this hosting company so that they get the call at 11 o'clock at night on December 24th when the system goes down. That's not going to be a call to me. I want to have a dedicated professional that's going to make sure that it's doing that. And again, this is a completely legitimate way to participate in the open source ecosystem. I'm wrapping up here. One of the key questions, that there was guidance in here from the DoD on whether they should be forking projects and creating their own version of projects, or whether they should be just using the publicly available one. I think this is a very important decision. I've been to conferences in SUNY where people are like, can't we just build our own open source project to do X, Y, or Z? And I'm actually pretty down on that. I don't want to be building stuff completely from scratch. So there's a spectrum of choices that you can make that say, you know what? I'm going to just adopt open source as is. I'm looking for the most mature projects, and I'm not going to do any development at all. I'm just going to be a user of this. You can say, you know what? I love this product, but it doesn't integrate with our library systems. And so I'm gonna commission a plugin that makes it integrate well with our library systems. That's a way to go. And I've kind of tried to put examples of different projects in the academic space that I'm aware of that are examples of that, where Commons in a Box Open Lab that we use at SUNY Oneonta on our WordPress. It's a series of plugins created by CUNY that help us do what we want to do with WordPress. Okay, CUNY has taken on the effort to create those, and I benefit as an open source user. And so although my choices, is I'm over here in the gray, I'm really benefiting from people who are over in the yellow, who are willing to take on those roles and those responsibilities. My final kind of question on here was, how will you contribute back to open source projects? And there's again, this is a range of ways you could do. Maybe you're able to divert some money to financially contribute to open source projects. Maybe there's a membership model, there's a direct contribution model where you can say, you know what, this has become mission critical to me. I will contribute to the ongoing professional maintenance of this. That would be a great policy. That's not going to be realistic for everyone. Maybe you're just able to say, you know what, I'm going to provide the time and tools for my team members to participate in this open source community. That would be a great policy, right? Being able to give your staff members time to be able to be an active participant in those communities. That's great. Maybe you don't have that from your own staff, but you've built relationships with security and accessibility efforts, and you're willing to pay for security or accessibility audits, and those will be published back to the community and contribute upstream. That would be a wonderful way for a state university to participate in an open source project. And at the very least, if you're making modifications, if you're making changes, if you're contributing to a plugin, if you have the ability to share them publicly on GitHub or other Git spaces like GitLab, that would be a great way to participate in an open source community. And I think that if you start to think about these questions, you can start to see that anatomy of an open source policy, that we could build this and it would make open source at our universities be on an more equal footing to be able to do that. That's what I wanted to share with you today, and I think I am right at 29 minutes and 40 seconds. So I have 15 seconds to answer any questions. hearing none, I just want to thank you for deciding to come to this talk. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I hope I see all of you back at the keynote at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Ed. That was great.
I guess I have one question. You've got me very interested. Where's this a starting point to kind of start to jump in? You mentioned I'm hearing the CUNY library, and is that on GitHub? I mean, just where's a starting point here?
Yeah, one of my starting points for open source is being able to run your own website.
Okay.
So I run a website. I bought my own domain, so you can visit my website at edbeck.com. And that's a simple way to dip your toe in the water, participating in an open source project. I run mine with WordPress, and I was part of the team that founded what we call SUNY Create, which provides free hosting for projects like this across SUNY. You can go to sunycreate.cloud, log in with your institutional ID, and if you're part of a participating campus, you can set up your own little server and start to
I
participate in
did,
that.
I just tried that, but they told me that my school isn't participating and that soon the cost, if your campus isn't participating, but you can look at some things and I will look at your website. So again, great presentation just to get some ideas going and how important this is.
Lisa, the vendor that we use at SUNY Create is Reclaim Hosting, and they
Yeah.
have some pretty affordable packages. If you can't get your institution to pay to dip your toe in the water, I think that their packages start at about $30 a year. That you could be on a shared hosting and be on a very similar infrastructure to what we run at SUNY Create. If you wanted to try like building your own personal website, and so if we can't pay for you because your institution isn't participating, there are other ways to go around that. And I still think running a personal website is a great first experience. And one of the things that I try to do with students to introduce them to open source and a little bit about how the internet works.
Okay, great, great. Thank you.
So now I'm 2 minutes over. I am going to be excommunicated from the leadership team. So I think I should let you all go. I'm willing to hang out for a minute if anybody else has another question, but please go eat lunch. Be back in time for the keynote because you won't want to miss it.